Michael, please could you give us some more kind of information about Duet and how you embody accompaniment there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually had no idea what the word accompaniment. If you'd asked me what accompaniment meant 2 years ago, I would have had absolutely no idea. It was something that honestly, probably Maddie from Insight uh, was probably the first person to use it around me and give me a little crash course in terms of what it meant. And um, I think my sort of definition of it fits into why perhaps Duet started along that road sort of non-intentionally, which is to me accompaniment is sort of just accepting that you're in the place of ignorance and that and the person you're talking to is the expert. And being someone who the first time I was in sort of an environment where there were lots of refugees and I was meeting for the first time, it was very easy to feel ignorant. So I think that sort of helped from the beginning. Um, but with Duet, it was always the idea that nobody knows better than the person in need what they need. And actually, I tell a little bit of an anecdote right now that I think is potent for a lot of people, which is sort of almost a year ago now, March. The world goes into lockdown, and I, like many other people, were took to Amazon and ordered a bunch of things that I needed to make living at home more enjoyable and survivable and everything like that. And I tell people, I say, imagine if instead of you being in charge of your Amazon account, somebody on the other side of the world, let's say somebody in Syria, was in charge of your Amazon account, and they were going to spend the exact same amount of money, but they were going to choose what to send you. Not only that, they were also going to be sending the exact same thing to everybody within a 2 mile radius of where you lived. And I sort of just posed the question, these Amazon packages arriving at your door, how useful are they going to be? If your close family can't always buy you the right present on your birthday, and they sometimes get it wrong, and you really wish you'd had a gift card instead, like how on earth is a complete stranger meant to choose what you need? And when organizations make these assumptions, they often get them wrong. And for very sort of, I suppose, clear reasons. And with Duet, we just wanted to flip it. And it's as simple as taking the exact same number of resources in terms of, people's desire to donate, and just make sure that it's only going towards things that have been, expressed as a need. And we thought if we could do that, we change it from being sort of maybe a 20 or 30% hit rate to being a 100% hit rate. And that I we didn't have the idea from the beginning of at least we didn't have anything like concrete in terms of this concept, but we just felt that, oh well, we have no idea, they have an idea, let's put them in a decision making position for something that's really going to be affecting them, and sort of see what happens. And the wonderful thing is that really it becomes clear there is a disconnect between, I think, what a lot of the things that people think people need and a lot of the things that they then express themselves. Um, the most wonderful example is every single family in the first month will always request a tea kettle, and that is not something I would have been able to predict. But now now it's almost a certainty. And you ask someone else who maybe doesn't understand the context, and they won't appreciate the cultural significance, the idea of welcoming someone into your home, the consistent, almost crazy nature in which they will always sort of provide you tea if you walk into into their tent or into their home. And that's really important. It's important for their identity, for their dignity, for their belief, for their feeling like they're connected to home. And that's they would much prefer that. And who am I to say otherwise? Who is anyone to say otherwise? And I think as soon as you sort of create that really would, I think, just a tool that they can use. And as soon as you create that and give it to them, and let other people choose in a sort of a dignified way, then you're going to have a lot more of a efficient system, and it's going to be, in the end, a lot more effective, which will eventually mean a lot more impactful.
Thank you. I really liked your analogy about about gifting even to family and friends, and therefore how can we possibly know what strangers we've never met might want. And that's actually something we're hoping to do a webinar on later in the year, is the idea of bad aid, or perhaps it might be kinder to say poorly chosen aid, which I think is something that everybody who works in this sector has experienced or come across at some point. So yeah, watch this space with regards to that topic. Anna, could you tell us more about how your organisation embodies accompaniment? I know for a fact that you certainly encountered poorly chosen donations in the past.
Sure did. Actually, it's really great hearing from the other speakers and realising all the points of connection, because Michael talking about listening being at the heart of accompaniment is really where it starts for us. So for us, accompaniment begins in the visits room in the detention centre, where our visitors go, kind of offering unconditional acceptance and really making listening into an art, I would say. And the tough thing about visiting is not being able to change the outcome for someone, so that this accompaniment is not goal directed. But the way that it's manifest is in walking alongside the person. So you might be in the visits room with someone and they might get the notification that they're about to be put on a deportation flight, and you can't change the outcome, but just being there, sharing the moment is what's important in that accompaniment. But people in detention repeatedly told our visitors that they wanted their stories heard, that they felt invisible. And many of them didn't feel safe to share their stories in the first person, either because they were asylum seekers and they thought their community, their country, individuals, they didn't want them to know where they were, because there was a stigma about being detained, and people wanted people to know about detention but not to know they personally had been detained, or because they were fearful of repercussions from the authorities if they raised their head above the parapet. And so we hit on the model, a literary model of the Canterbury Tales, great work of fiction, British work of fiction, and we took the model of walking and sharing tales, and we connected people who had been in detention with famous writers who wrote their stories. And we went on a long walk every year, or we did before COVID, and every evening on the walk, whatever town, village or city we arrived in, we had free events and invited in the community, and the stories were shared together with music, and it was something really, really joyful. And so that this walking alongside someone in the visits room then became a literal walking alongside. And not only that, but people who had been invisible while they were being walked alongside became visible in the landscape. And you would see this wonderful kind of stream of people all in Refugee Tales blue t-shirts walking across hills or through urban environments. And there was a transformation in the walking, and it was for everyone. So going back to what Dani said, this was co-powerment, if that's the word you used. And I can remember one man who'd been in detention coming on a walk and saying his face hurt, and we were worried he had toothache. We couldn't work out what it was. It turned out he was using his smile muscles that he hadn't used for so long previously that it was actually making his face hurt. And then one of our walkers who hadn't experienced detention but had come alongside and walked on our 5-day walk said that when she went home and looked in the mirror, she was shocked because her face looked the same as it had before she came on the walk, and yet she felt inside completely different, and she just couldn't recognize the person in the mirror because she felt so different. So that transformational process is felt by everyone walking together and forming a community. And I know I came to your last webinar, and somebody there was saying that the key feature of accompaniment was that it was not short-term support. And what we found from our long walk is that everyone who took part, who was forming a community, wished for the walks to continue. And so we started to have monthly walks in between our long summer walks. And just over time, I think we found that the trust in the process, in the accompaniment, has made all things possible, and some really remarkable things that we couldn't have foreseen possible. And well, you guys, you'll have to come along. That's that's for sure.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that accompaniment is long term, and it really has to be. You can't be with someone for one moment and then just say goodbye and never see or hear from them again and never have any further interaction with them, because then it really isn't accompaniment at all. It would be good to hear from everyone what lessons you've learned around accompaniment since starting your respective projects. Michael, how would you feel about starting us off this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just sort of really understanding how inadequate I would be at trying to like create an aid package for someone, or like just the more and more families that we meet and start using our platform, and the more and more things that get requested, the more and more just, at a quite some of the things come up often in terms of, there are certain things like laundry detergent that, well, quite frankly, people need at a reasonably consistent rate, and like that's not all that surprising anymore. I mean, the first time I would have never have thought of it, but the third time it's like, okay, yeah, I understand people need this kind of stuff. But at a pretty consistent basis, you get these outliers for these unique stories, and they're but it's a perfect match, and so I think just consistently seeing and forcing myself to acknowledge that I really shouldn't be allowed to make any decisions in other people's lives has sort of been a constant over these 2 years. But I think in terms of somewhere where we're still learning is actually that long-term aspect, and how to it's something that we've certainly struggled with. And the first time we started onboarding families, we said it would be for a year. Fairly arbitrary, just because, I mean, the only reason we said it was a year is because like a year is 12 months, 12 months is a year. Like a year sounds like a long time, but not too long, but like not too short. A year, perfect. We'll do a year. Like we had absolutely no evidence to put behind that. And then we've sort of been tinkering around with, okay, actually, how long should a family be on our platform? How long is appropriate? How long is effective? At what point do we say that the last month for a family is less important than the first month for another family? If we viewed it as sort of bed spaces, how many, at what point would we suggest someone, vacate that spot for somebody else? And actually trying to deal with that, how long term do you go, has actually been something that we've, I don't have I've learned that I don't know yet. And that's still something we're constantly analyzing and trying to figure out based off, what we've seen happen. One of the cool things is we can track what gets requested, and it's pretty cool because it actually follows. I don't like Maslow's hierarchy of needs completely. I think it lacks something, but the requests do actually kind of follow up up his pyramid, which is pretty cool. So at the moment we kind of use once people are requesting certain types of items, we tend to then say a couple months of that, and then we would onboard a new family. But still, it's something that's flexible and still going up and down, and we still haven't gotten to an answer yet, I don't think.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point, actually. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that you could make a really interesting study of the data from Duet in terms of what people are most likely to request, and also on the outliers as well, and so on. But I really liked your point as well about almost about ignorance, really, isn't it? It's ignorance as a positive, in the sense it's accepting our own ignorance of what people's needs are, and recognizing that that is going to be a lifelong ignorance, that we can learn more, but fundamentally we will never be able to know what people's needs are without engaging with them, without talking to them. And that's very much at the heart of accompaniment. Anna, could you maybe talk to us a little bit about what you've learned around this, maybe since starting Refugee Tales, because it's been several years now, so I'm sure you've had some interesting lessons learned there.
I guess a lot of our learning's been about being dynamic. So, we felt that we created a model that we were really happy with and we loved, and other people seemed to love. But that can never stand still for too long. So the people that shared their tales with us in year one, who kind of grew in confidence, and who we learned so much from as walkers, came to a point where we couldn't keep working with them and trapping them in a victim narrative. So these tales that had been published, that at first we had two people with a legal background taking the tales to parliamentarians and saying, look, listen to these stories, there has to be change. We kind of abandoned that model, and the people who had told the stories, we developed as a parliamentary self-advocacy group, and they are now the people who take the books to people of influence, but not to tell their stories yet again, but to say, I have lived experience, these are the issues, and then to call for change themselves, because I feel unless people call for change themselves, it's never going to happen. If you look at the history of the women's movement. So yeah, not trapping people in a victim narrative, although it was important that their stories were heard, and just constantly exploring ways that we can work together to bring about change. Has to be an important part of accompaniment, because we could accompany people with similar experiences forever and the world might never get better. So we have to do something to address the systemic issues at the same time. And I think we found a way to marry that by expressing accompaniment on the tales, people sharing the tales, but then also speaking to people of influence to try and create change. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that accompaniment, although in many ways it is something that we do with grassroots work, it also there needs to be an element of calling for systemic change as well, I think, and trying to implement systemic change where we have the ability to do so. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, that there needs to be a level of kind of policy advocacy as well. Dani, could you talk to us a bit about what lessons you've learned around accompaniment, both since starting with Insight and maybe also since you finished your thesis as well?
Yeah, I would say Michael and Anna addressed a lot of similar issues. I think learning to listen, honestly, is like the #1 way to do accompaniment, and also sometimes the hardest lesson. And I think really acknowledging that accompaniment is messy. Like, there is no clear-cut, formulaic, this is how you do this. It's being adaptive, being dynamic, as Anna said, listening and acknowledging your ignorance, being humble in the situation. And I think, shout out to Maddie. So Maddie is our executive director as well as our current on-ground staff lead. And accompaniment is not always convenient or easy, especially for those people who are like in relationship with those that we're walking alongside. There is phone calls at midnight and things to do where you don't have the answer, but the people that you're in relationship with are calling on you to listen to them, to be with them, maybe to advocate for them, and you do your best. And then you learn and you make mistakes and you ask for forgiveness and move on and continue to do your best. And so it's very messy. There is no formulaic way to do it. I think for me, coming from healthcare, I think we see this trend in healthcare in the US where we're looking at protocols and policies for everything. So a patient comes in with asthma, how do you take care of every patient who has asthma? And I think that that's, to be honest, a real harm both in the healthcare field as well as in the humanitarian sector, because I see that bleeding over into the humanitarian sector where, okay, you have this thing happen, what's the formulaic answer and how do we like address this thing? And that's not how it works. Each person is an individual. Each situation is like has its own context and situation. And so how do we address that? Now, with that being said, obviously there are systemic issues that need to be addressed. So one of the things I've learned since my thesis, I'm a bit of an optimist. It's challenging to live in a world when you're an optimist sometimes because you're like, the answer is clear. Let's just all do it this way and it'll be fine. And that's not really how things work. So one of the things I talked about in my thesis is the systemic violence that exists in the humanitarian sector, whether that's on the ground response for refugees in refugee camps or like Anna's experience in detention centers and in third-party countries. And there's a lot of systemic violence built into the whole system. And being able to see the violence that exists even among well-meaning people, right? How do humanitarian actors actually potentiate this violence through the work that they do? Or kind of like, I loved Anna's point about, continued victimization. For a lot of people in the humanitarian sector, if a person lives in a refugee camp, you get a lot more attention, right? They look sad. It's like poverty porn, right? You look sad, you look like you're in need of help, and that brings in more money and resources, and we need money and resources because we're drowning. And so we're just going to continue this cycle, and no one's ever feeling autonomous. They're not feeling dignity, and they're not getting freed of the situation, right? Because this is supposed to be a temporary situation. And one of the things you see in the humanitarian sector is you see people living in refugee camps or in temporary situations for decades. Like, it's not ending in a year or two. It's sometimes just not ending. If you're interested, do research on stateless people. Nothing has been solved, right? You see Palestinian refugees have been refugees for a long time, 60 years. Like, we're not changing anything. And now we just learned to exist in this space. And so I think accompaniment is messy. There's no clear-cut answer. And it's hard to convince people of this change because people want safety, security, and I think they, only want to help as is comfortable. And to change a whole system that's not working well is both an unknown and it's also really uncomfortable. And I think it calls us all out on the ways that we've participated in it.
Thank you, Dani. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about how often these issues can be long-term or even permanent, not merely in a global sense, but even for individuals, that these issues can be permanent, and that really speaks to a failure of political will to actually solve some of the kind of political issues that lead to these problems in the first place. We've received a question in the chat, so I'd just like to ask it of the whole panel now. Someone has asked, what are some of the new challenges that your organisation is encountering due to COVID-19? And what are some of the ways that you think the accompaniment mindset or model is doing to help address those challenges? Is there anyone who would like to speak to that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's a lot of problems because of COVID-19 for us. I think both our like, value add and what we were good at suddenly became like very much what we were bad at. In the, part of the Duet mindset was actually, let's take away as much of the humanitarian actor as possible. Let's, we try not to, like, after the original onboarding, we actually try to have very little contact with the families we work with, and, try and treat it as if they were, ordering something off their own app. Like, we try and distend ourselves from it. I would gladly have, no refugee family know my name or anyone on the Duets team's name, like, forever. Like, we completely try and separate ourselves from it and have them, express their needs once through the app, through their own, on their own schedule. Like, they're not asking us permission for anything that, we don't exist, kind of thing. That was great until all the stores closed because of COVID, and then, like, the Duet system couldn't really work anymore. And then, all the detachment we'd gone through intentionally suddenly became a real issue because, we didn't have the sort of on the ground infrastructure where we were constantly sort of engaging with the people we work with. So that caused a lot of problems, and in terms of, like, our accompaniment model sort of broke down. There have been ways we've been trying to rectify that, but it's been just quite difficult. Very exciting for us, the stores in Athens have just reopened. And, they've opened periodically throughout the last sort of 10 months, but whenever they've been shut, it's very much put us on the back foot. And what we've been able to do is pre-fund families, which is quite nice. So families can request things as soon as they can request and get things donated as soon as they can get to the stores. But we've been pretty tied up with COVID.
Thank you. Yeah, that isn't something that I had considered, actually, but now you mention it, it seems really obvious. Of course, when the shops are all shut, it's going to be a lot harder for your work to be done.
Shall I just reflect on it for our work, Daniel? Yeah.
Thank you.
So similarly, if you can imagine, if the basis of one of our models is walking and talking, we're not allowed to go out of our houses that much at the moment. This is pretty tricky. And also destitution is so much of a greater problem now, and people who are relying on food banks are finding that food banks are overwhelmed. So these are all issues, but I would say that I can't exactly remember the question now, but I would say that the challenge for us is to make the light of accompaniment shine even brighter, because the real problem for us right now is sort of countering fear. So if I go outside now for a walk and my neighbours are out for a walk, we have to cross the road because we're scared to be close, and we're scared of people coming across borders, and people are being housed when they come across borders, and we have new camps for asylum seekers springing up in the UK, and all these things create an atmosphere of fear. And so I think we just have to shine ever more brighter and be ever more creative about the ways we manifest accompaniment in a time when it feels almost impossible because we can't be in the same physical space.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. I think COVID is certainly causing a lot of people to reflect on where they stand on borders, and unfortunately that's not always going to have a very happy effect on the atmosphere or on the discourse within the country.
Yeah, and I'll speak a little bit. So we currently work in Greece, and with COVID, a lot of the camps are shut down. Some of them have been closed altogether, and people are not allowed in very easily. So, I mean, that's been a huge detriment, trying to get resources to those communities, doing any drives. So we run the Brothers campaign with another wonderful person, Ruhi. And so Maddie and Ruhi are kind of the heads of that, but they work a lot with the brothers, so single men in Greece. And unfortunately, just access to the community has been really limited. So one of the ways accompaniment has helped is that accompaniment is relational, right? So it's about building relationships. So the brothers have Maddie and Ruhi's numbers. They still text, they still WhatsApp. We're still aware of some of the things that are happening. It's just our ability to access and to help has been really challenging. But one of the things that's kind of been positive, I think, as a lot of people have seen, is that as everyone's gone to Zoom and we're doing things like this, our access has gotten much larger. So at least our education program has really grown during COVID, and our ability to talk to other people, to share these ideas, to be inclusive. And it's been really good for us to sort of move, I think, a little bit faster than we had been intending, to both help share this information with people who maybe are not as aware, but as well as really starting to dig down deep and figure out how are we going to help with education for the brothers, for the group that we're working with, when we don't necessarily have any more access to them than phone. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it's nice that you've pointed out a kind of positive side effect as well, in the sense that I think you're right that in some ways there is a lot more out there. There's a lot more accessible information and sessions, and even totally unrelated to this subject. I think in other ways this is improving accessibility, at least for some groups. I know people who have mobility issues who have found it a lot easier to attend events as they've gone online than they were ever able to do when those events were taking place, at event venues and so on. Where they might not have been able to get to the nearest city where they're taking place or something. So yeah, it's nice to have that one positive side effect as well, even among all the terrible things that have been going on. We've had another question in the chat. Someone has asked, how can people do, and do is in quote marks, how can people do accompaniment in their everyday lives? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in right away if that's okay. Obviously, I'm really passionate about the idea of accompaniment, using this term, trying to perpetuate this term and make it more common. So this is a question I've thought a lot about personally. I think it's really hard for me because you see lots of groups. How can I want to start accompanying everybody? I'm a very relational person, and I have a lot more relational energy than probably most people do. But even then, you still have to take time for yourself. And so, how do we do accompaniment? Accompaniment is literally like, how do you be in relationship with people well? It means, extending sort of what you consider your in-group. We talk, there's a lot of really great resources and books out there about like ideas of exclusion and embrace, and who's your in-group and who's considered a part of that. Who do you sort of include within your circle of people that you kind of identify with? And so I think one of the things an individual can do specifically is to expand that circle. So this means, normally, so I'm from the US, obviously I'm a white female. And so my in-group tends to reflect my ideas, my looks, my beliefs. And so how do I actually extend that? How do I make that bigger? And so that means becoming friends with people who aren't necessarily like me, who maybe have different beliefs or are from different economic backgrounds or different racial backgrounds, and not doing it for the tokenism of like, look at me, but doing it for the relationship. And I think coming to a place where you are humble and you are in it to be in relationships. So the best, I think, picture of accompaniment, there's two. And I think Anna has really done a great job in reflecting the walking alongside piece. It's this, I'm going on a journey with you and I'm going to walk with you and we're going to go over hurdles together and we're going to help each other. I don't know if you ever want to watch anything inspirational, watching like races where somebody's like falling in the middle of the race and some other racer is like helping them across the finish line. It's like that, how do we walk with people? How do we overcome obstacles together? And my other favorite analogy is the dinner table. How can we come to the table with people that we maybe wouldn't normally come to the table with? And eating food together. This is one of the things I love about Middle Eastern culture. Michael talked about the hospitality piece. The Middle Eastern culture embodies hospitality in a way I just haven't seen in a lot of other cultures, definitely in my own. And, you know, how can I just invite strangers into this table to eat dinner with me, with people I wouldn't normally talk to or maybe would disagree with? You know, living in the US, I think a really radical way to do this is to even like talk to people across political lines, you know, because it's not about necessarily agreeing on everything. And I know some disagreements have a lot more personal or traumatic meaning to them, but the only way that anyone's going to change their mind is through relationships. It's not through proving them wrong. That's not how people change. And I think the same goes for political advocacy, right? It's through relationships with politics and with people who can make those decisions that you're going to actually create change. It's not going to be necessarily through just like absolute proof, because there's too much complexity to those situations.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like you've given us some really interesting things to think about there. I'd especially love to hear from Michael next if you have anything to say on that question, Michael, just because Dani, you spoke really well to the relational side of it. And earlier, Michael, you were saying that your ideal as far as Duet's work goes is to detach entirely from the relational side of it. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. You know, maybe what Duet does is like actually the opposite of accompaniment. If we're completely detached. But you know, I mean, I don't think it is. You know, I think it might just be a slightly different version. But you know, I'm not sure you have the opportunity necessarily. You know, accompaniment is a pretty active and intense process. Like, I don't think it is something that can be done really quickly and maybe actually every, you know, you don't have the opportunity every day to do it. You know, how many times do you have the, you know, I don't have any opportunity in my day-to-day life typically to even meet a new person, let alone be in a relationship with that person. So you know, I think it's less about, you know, doing it every day, but I think you can prime yourself constantly so that when the opportunity does arise, you're actually prepared to be to accompany someone and to be in the right position to do accompaniment. And I think actually what Dani was saying, I think is probably right on the mark of you know, participating in things that push you outside of your own circles and your own mindset. And really, I think something that's come up a lot, at least I've said a lot, is talking about ignorance and humbling yourself. You know, I don't think you're going to be in a position to, you know, when the opportunity arises to accompany anyone if you really don't have the ability to be humble and accept your own ignorance. And I think that really is a precursor, and that's something you can do every day. But, you know, I don't know how much, you know, one can actually do accompaniment every day without it perhaps being your profession. But, you know, I don't think you run into accompaniment in the grocery store.
I think that's a really good point, actually. It's, I think, like any idea or skill or philosophy, I think accompaniment is something that does need to be practiced and reflected on so that when the opportunities come up to actually make use of that and to put it into practice, then you can exemplify it more readily if you have been practicing it and reflecting on it. So I think in that regard, it's like any other philosophy. And for what it's worth, I certainly do. Oh, sorry, Dani.
Sorry. I just wanted to interject. I really like what Michael said. And I just want to also point out, I think accompaniment is also about being willing to receive. So it's not always about you doing the thing. It's also about you being willing to receive somebody else coming alongside you. So just throw that out there too.
Thank you. Anna, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, just really quickly, because I'm aware of the time. So I think in our everyday lives, so welcome and empathy may be, you know, quite instinctive. But I think Dani's right, that it's when you get to political discourse that things get more challenging. And the beautiful thing about walking alongside someone is that you're all walking towards the same horizon. And I think that's really important to embody in lots of ways, so that rather than talking across a table, the dinner table or whatever table it is, actually walking in the same direction towards the same horizon is really important. And for us, in terms of political discourse, what we're trying to, we've got a new project called A Walking Inquiry, and we're taking an issue, in this case the issue of detention, and as a community we're going on walks and having explorations. And I think that the way we're embodying accompaniment in that manifestation is that it's not questions and answers, but it's the whole community exploring together. And I guess that's what one would try to do in political discussions, though it's sometimes really tricky.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well, about that kind of messiness of political discourse and the difficulty of applying accompaniment in that arena, but it's still really crucial to at least attempt to do so. We've not had any more questions. I'd like to quickly ask each of you myself, if there is anything, just to kind of close off really, is there anything that you think that we could be doing better as organizations, as individuals, as a sector? Is there anything that we could be doing better to better model accompaniment and to better walk alongside people? And that can also maybe function as your closing thought, if you like. Is there anyone who'd like to start us off there? Definitely a no from Michael. Dani, do you feel comfortable starting us off there, maybe?
Sure, I can. Well, as a sector, what can we do better? So many things. That's why we're talking about accompaniment. You know, working in the humanitarian aid sector, there's a lot of things that are done well, and I don't want to negate that. But there's a lot of things that aren't done well, right? And being honest about that, and then actually actively working towards change. I think, you know, the humanitarian aid world is really an interesting one. And the UNHCR several years ago actually announced that like a refugee camp model is actually a really unhealthy model. It can really increase violence and trauma and destitution, and it's just not a healthy model for communities to be existing in. And yet it's still the main response that we have. Now, a lot of people end up in cities now. That's becoming more and more common. But at least as an organized model from both government standpoints and the UNHCR, there's still some sort of encampment to that, right? And so listening to communities and actually being willing to change what we're doing. We don't have to continue down the same path. I think I've been told once before the analogy of like, why are roads the size that they are? Because train tracks were a certain size and then the roads just went to reflect those, right? Or carriages or something along those lines. It was told to me by an engineer, so I don't really remember. But, you know, being aware that just because things have been a certain way doesn't mean they have to continue in that way. You know, working in healthcare for a really long time, there's so many things wrong with the healthcare system, especially in the US, and yet everyone knows it and people are really upset by it. But then they all just feel sort of like, but this is just the way it is. And so then change isn't possible because people lose hope. And so I think, you know, how do we move forward? You have to believe change is possible. You have to hope that it's possible. And then you have to be willing to do it for the long haul, because it's not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen after repetition and repetition and repetition. And you're going to move 2 steps forward, 1 step back, just like we do when we do self-work, right? Like when we work on ourselves, we're not a new person overnight. That's not how that works. And so expanding that to the whole sector. I think having that perspective and then having the ability to like continue. I think there's a lot of burnout in the humanitarian sector, in casework, in healthcare, all of these caring sectors where you're really working against systemic violence and against systems that just don't work. there's just tons and tons and tons of burnout. And so how do we recognize the longevity of the work that needs to be done, as well as taking care of ourselves in a way that we can maintain that work and maintain going in that way? So the other thing I would say is self-care is really, really important. Understanding your motives as to why you're working in this sector, what you're trying to accomplish, and being critical about that. And then coming up with ways to bolster yourself and your community and the work that you're doing is really important.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm absolutely with you there, especially on the importance of self-care. I think that's hugely important, no matter what role you're playing or what background you're coming at this from. I think self-care is hugely important. Would anyone else like to comment on this last question?
I could say a tiny thing. I just think it's really, really difficult to build things up and really easy to break them down. So I think the thing that we could all do better is to be really, really vigilant about the battles that we think we've won, just suddenly disappearing and having to be worked at all over again.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's hugely pertinent on a political level at the moment, but it's also very relevant to individual projects on a grassroots level as well. Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add, Michael? Or
yes, I just didn't want to go first. I think the sector needs to take a slightly more long-term view. I think we've gotten, as a sector, human race, however you want to call it, I think we're actually pretty good now at making sure people don't die in crises, which is really important. The 2 days, the first 2 days after a disaster, humanity's gotten very, very good at that. Water arrives, food arrives, tents arrive, doctors arrive. It's actually, I think, quite impressive how quickly sort of suddenly a whole sort of city infrastructure could be built, out of nothing in 2 days. And that's wonderful. But as soon as you're in crisis mode, you don't want to look up 10 years later and realize that we've been treating this like crisis mode for 10 years. And, 10 years shouldn't look like, well, I have no idea. 10 years shouldn't look like 2 days worth of crises the entire time. Like you can't behave the same way in 2-day increments for 10 years and expect things to really be different. And until I think people start sort of acknowledging, okay, we've got this part sorted. Now we need to figure out what the next 50 years looks like. So, after you come in and provide sort of, yes, life-saving support, really, really basic needs. After you supply that, what's the strategy there? What do we do next? And that's something that I think the whole industry hasn't got an answer to yet. And I think if people start taking a little bit more of a long view, say, okay, how do we improve the next 50 years, not just the next 2 days, then things will start to look a little bit different. Then I think things like relationship building, community building, all those things suddenly become a lot more important. But I would say also the reason that it hasn't happened is that the crisis is a lot more engaging. And I actually think it's hard to step back and say, and sort of ignore the emotional pull, which is potent, and step back and say, actually, we're going to take a little bit of a longer view, which is going to be more complicated. It's going to be harder, and it's probably going to be less emotionally rewarding, but it's going to be more important for an individual's future. If you take a refugee, people, you might be a refugee in a camp for 2 years, but the next 48 living in a host country, is still important years of your life. It's still part of the refugee journey, and it still needs to be something that people try and support and try and set you up for success in. It's not just about those 2 days. It's not just about those 2 years. It's about an entire life. And I think that needs to be brought in more now that we've had so much success in that initial crisis period.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's as you say, it's something that we haven't got very good at yet, is taking the long view. And I think that's shown by the fact that there are conflicts that happened decades ago where there is still rebuilding taking place to this day. And the news cycle has moved on. People are mostly not aware of the rebuilding taking place in various countries in the Caucasus, in parts of Africa, in Latin America, and so on, because the news cycle has moved on to other conflicts that are perhaps more intense at this moment in time. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We're much better at looking at the short-term crisis than we are at the kind of long-term reconstruction and development that's needed. Well, thank you all so much. We are planning on running webinars twice a month throughout 2021. So please do keep an eye on our newsletters. We're planning on looking at various topics, including censorship and the effects of COVID. And we hope to get some poets together in April to showcase some refugee and diaspora poets. So yes, please do watch this space. And we've had various thank yous from in the chat as well. So yeah, a huge thank you to all of our panelists. You've all come at this from very different backgrounds or organizations. And I really appreciate all of you taking time out of your day to come and speak to our audience. So yeah, thank you very much. And
thank you for having us.
Oh, it's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be uploading this to YouTube at some point over the next few days. So if anyone would like to listen to it again, or if anyone hasn't had a chance to see it yet, I hope that you'll be able to find it there soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to
Bye.
meet everyone. Bye.
Bye.